So, a couple things before we get going. So we'll start module 11 today. That module reading was due before we started class today. We'll have participation quizzes today and tomorrow. And then after tomorrow's class, that module 11 quiz will pop up there. We've got the practice problems to kind of look through before you take that quiz. Module 10 quiz and the participation quizzes from the last 2 days are all going to be due at the same time, which is the end of the day, Sunday. All right, so a little more flexibility in this week prior to when we'll take the final. We'll start module 12 on Friday, so that module reading is due before we start class Friday. We'll finish it up on Monday. We'll then do module 13 next Tuesday, Thursday, next Tuesday, Wednesday, review on Thursday, and the next week will be that final exam, okay? So I've already got up the practice final if you want to take a look at it. I also put up this hypothetical grade tool. So there's a bunch of different tabs here if you open it up. Because I dropped the lowest 2 quiz scores, lowest 4 in-class quizzes, your lowest module reading, you can kind of, Canvas is kind of giving you a worst case scenario calculation of your grade right now. What you can do is use this file and basically, so notice some of them haven't happened yet, but this hypothetical person, I put in all of their scores for all the participation quizzes up to this point, right? And then as we have more participation quizzes, you could kind of, start to add in what those scores are for those quizzes. And what it does is it calculates what your current score is with the 4 lowest dropped, right? So right now, this person, it's kind of figuring out what those 4 lowest are. It's then calculating what the current participation grade would be. Same kind of idea for the quizzes. As we do more of them, you can kind of put your scores in there. And notice it updates it, so identifies the lowest and calculates your current quiz score. Same thing for the module reading. We only have 1 module reading. I mean, I guess technically we have 2 left, 12 and 13. But it does the same thing. And then this hypothetical grade tab just pulls those scores from those different tabs. So it kind of puts in what your score in each of those categories is with the corresponding lowest being dropped. You can then put in your first and second midterm, right? You can put it in here or in here, whichever you prefer. Both rows are going to do the same thing. You can then kind of have what your current kind of quiz scores are with the lowest dropped. This is like if you just wanted to, and actually here, I might update this and just get rid of this row. It was I had ideas about it. Really, this last row is the one that people have been asking about, kind of giving that grade with the lowest dropped. You could then play around with, okay, what if I get, I don't know, 90 on the final? What would my final grade be? What if I get 55, right, et cetera, et cetera. But it's going to require you to, I can't do this for every student in terms of putting your individual scores in there. So that is going to be a little bit of legwork on your end if you want to use this tool. Okay. And if you have any questions on it, feel free to let me know and kind of help you with it. But other than that, any logistical questions before we jump into module 11 here? Okay. So monopolies, right? Last 2 days, we've talked about perfectly competitive market. That's kind of our baseline, right? That's like our perfect scenario. Many firms, many buyers, nobody has any influence over the price. However, we know that in practice, we are going to have certain industries where we don't have many buyers, or we don't have many sellers, and firms do have influence over the price. So we're going to look at the other extreme, which is a monopoly. One firm is the only person producing this good. So usually this is going to be created because of barriers to entry. So we kind of talked about some of these last class, or it might have even been Monday. All right, maybe someone owns a key resource. So this is like De Beers owns like almost all of, so it's not a complete monopoly, but it's close to it, where they have a large majority of the raw diamond mines in the world. So if you want to, do something with diamonds, you've got to kind of purchase them from one seller, right? That's the idea of monopoly, right? Now you can't just create diamonds out of thin air. And so because they own this key resource, they have monopoly power. Sometimes we'll see the government gives exclusive rights, right, to different companies to be able to act like a monopoly. So, think about, probably not as relevant now in terms of, because we have like competitors like UPS, but the post office originally was a monopoly, right? It was the only mail carrier in the country, and that was kind of given to them the exclusive rights with the government. We also see like local governments give different companies rights to be the electric provider in that area, or there's only one water company, right, in that area. Those are going to be kind of government created or government protected monopolies. Okay. Now, usually that coincides with the idea that there is a natural monopoly. So natural monopolies can arise. So what is creating a barriers to entry? So with perfectly competitive markets, we said firms can freely enter and exit the market. One thing that can create a problem with firms being able to enter a market is if there's only enough demand to support one company. So the example would be like a water or electric company. If there's huge fixed cost to putting up power lines, right? We actually don't want multiple electric companies. Why? Well, each company would have their own power lines, right? We have them running all over the place. So these huge fixed costs make it such that if one firm is selling this product, they can earn profits. As soon as a second firm enters the market, it decreases. It's like splits demand, right? And in splitting demand, it now forces each firm now has negative profits. So what does one firm do? Exit. We're back to one firm. That's the idea of a natural monopoly. There's only enough demand to support one firm existing in that market. And we'll talk a little more specifically about natural monopolies next class, but this is how we can kind of see monopolies pop up. So how are they going to be different than our perfectly competitive market? So the first thing will be, when we're talking about our perfectly competitive market, we said each firm's demand curve was they simply took whatever that equilibrium price was, and that was the price they had to set. So that became the firm's demand curve, or we said their marginal revenue. So if a firm wants to kind of increase the quantity they're selling, well, they can produce more. They just have to keep selling it at that same price, right? So they don't have to lower the price. They just keep selling it whatever the equilibrium price is. Okay? They didn't have any influence over that price. So even though they were producing more or less, that didn't change the market enough to where the equilibrium price changed. So we had the price was equal to marginal revenue for these perfectly competitive firms, and that was the individual firm's demand curve. However, the monopolist, they face the entire market demand curve. If they're the only producer of this good, when they're thinking about, okay, how much should I produce? Well, they do have an influence over the price. With perfectly competitive firms, you can think about it as like their production was such a small percent of the overall market, it didn't shift the market. Right? With a monopolist, when they change their output or quantity, well, they're the only producer. It changes the supply in the market. So monopolists are going to make this production decision, and they're going to face the entire market demand curve because they're the only seller of this good. What will end up being true is the price that they are able to set is not going to be the same as their marginal revenue. Okay. Now we'll kind of walk through here in a second as to why, but for now it's perfectly competitive market, price was equal to marginal revenue. Monopoly market, price will not be equal to marginal revenue. Okay. And we can start to see now, like before we had a difference in market and firm demand. Now, because there's only one producer, the market demand is the firm's demand curve that they face. So think about a very basic example. So we've got some coffee shop, right? Let's think if I had a demand schedule. So I have these different price quantity combinations, right? How could I calculate total revenue? Well, total revenue is simply going to be the price I can sell the good for times the quantity I'm selling. Right? So we can calculate total revenue pretty easily. Okay? Now, average revenue, if you think back to a perfectly competitive market, how much was I selling each good or each unit for? Whatever the equilibrium price was. So the average revenue, we didn't really talk about it, but it simply was the price. Okay? With a monopolist, notice what's happening to average revenue. Well, if I want to sell one more unit, I have to lower the price here, right? So in order to convince consumers to buy more of this product, I've got to lower the price because I know the consumer's marginal benefits are decreasing. So if I calculate average revenue, that's simply total revenue over quantity. So for the first one, that would be 4. Second unit, 7 over 2 is 3.5. 9 over 3 is 3, etc. Okay. So we'll kind of notice here, the price that they're charging ends up being, well, that's how much money I'm making per unit. So if I want to sell more units, in order to do that, I have to lower the price. My average revenue will just be whatever that price is, right? So my average revenue and my price are the same thing for a monopolist, and that would be true for a perfectly competitive firm as well. What's not true is that the marginal revenue for these monopolists is not going to be the same as price. So if we look at these total revenue values, if I want to go from selling nothing to 1 unit, I have to lower the price from 450 to 4. Just like, we've talked about calculating marginal cost as the change in total cost divided by a change in quantity. Marginal revenue, change in total revenue divided by a change in quantity. So 4 divided by 1 here would give me a marginal revenue of 4. But if I want to go from 1 to 2 units, change in the total revenue is 3 divided by a change in quantity of 1. Notice my marginal revenue, as I want to produce more, sell more, I have to lower the price. My marginal revenue is decreasing. Okay? So I've got this reduction in my marginal revenue as I want to sell more units. So price is not the same as my marginal revenue. In fact, price will end up being above. Notice here for like the second to the third unit, the marginal revenue was 2, my price was 3. Okay. So if I were to graph these, put these on the same graph, and I'll draw you a more continuous version here, but since we have jumps of 1, if I just graphed out those price quantity combinations, that would be my demand curve. Okay. Notice what's going to be true about my marginal revenue. So at the quantity of 1, marginal revenue is 4, quantity of 2, it's 3. If I graph those points out, my marginal revenue curve will always be below my demand curve. And if I calculated the slope here, so the change in Y over the change in X, so change in price over the change in quantity, here I noticed that, okay, every time I want to go up by 1 unit, the price has to fall by 50 cents. So it'll be like negative 0.5. But notice for my marginal revenue, every time I want to sell 1 more unit, my marginal revenue decreases by $1. So my marginal revenue will not only be below the demand curve, it'll be twice as steep. And I'll kind of give you some support behind why, some equations here in a second. Okay. All right. So because the monopolist has to set the price, they're not a price taker, they're setting the price, their marginal revenue ends up being below the demand curve, right? Excuse me. And I'm going to I'll jump the gun here. So why is it twice as steep? So if I think about my total revenue, that's going to be price times quantity. We said that, going way back to like module 3, we have a demand equation, right? Which is the price as a function of the quantity. I turned off already. These things have quick things in the summer. Okay. So if I'm thinking about here's quantity, here's price. My demand equation, the intercept is A, slope, well, it's going to be B, but we always know the slope is negative, so you can kind of think about it like negative B. It'll be our slope for our demand equation. What is my total revenue? Well, total revenue is price times quantity. I could substitute in for price that demand equation because I know that the monopolist is setting the price based off of consumers' willingness to pay or based off of the demand curve. So I would then have A plus B times Q, or A times Q plus B times Q squared. Well, if I want to find my marginal revenue, marginal anything, we usually write this kind of using these triangles. So like the change in total revenue coming from a change in quantity, that's the same thing as taking the derivative, right? So if I take a derivative of this function for total revenue in respect to quantity, what am I left with? A plus 2 times B times Q. Notice my marginal revenue will start out at the same point as my demand curve. However, it's going to be twice as steep. Okay? So that's kind of where that comes from, right? That's the reason why marginal revenue will be below the demand curve for the monopolist, because if they're using that demand curve to set the price, the math works out that marginal revenue earned in each unit will be kind of that slope for marginal revenue be twice as steep as whatever that relationship was for price and quantity from our demand curve. Okay. All right. So there's going to be two effects that exist. If a firm wants to sell more units, we know they're going to have to lower the price. Okay. So what is the ultimate impact that this is going to have on total revenues? Because if I'm selling more units, that's going to improve my total revenues. But if it's at lower prices, that's going to decrease my total revenues. So there's a price and an output effect. Right? So if I want to sell a larger quantity, I've got to lower the price. My marginal revenue will always be below the price because I won't just have the price effect, I'm going to have the output effect as well. Okay. And in fact, we'll see that marginal revenue could even be, in our previous example, yes, it's decreasing. There is a point, though, where at certain quantities, marginal revenue could actually be negative. Right? So to kind of give a little bit of an insight behind why, before we look at this graph, if I have total revenue, that's price times quantity. Okay. I know that if I want to sell more units, all right, so maybe I can sell a lot more units from a small decrease in the price. Okay. So here, if that price effect is less than the output effect, what's going to happen to my total revenues? Well, this is going to be the larger effect. So that's going to be the one that wins out, or the kind of, going to dictate what the total effect is. Right? Or you can think about it here. That price effect is less than the output effect. So if the output effect is larger, and output, I'm selling more units, kind of my total effect is going to be that total revenue goes up. Now, if I had a scenario where total revenue, that price times quantity, maybe I'm selling more units, but I had to decrease the price by a lot. Well, now my price effect is greater than my output effect. So what is the total effect going to be? Well, as I sell more units, yeah, that helps my total revenue, but the price decrease hurts it even more. There I would see my total revenue actually decreases. So anytime a firm is setting a price, right, if they want to sell more units, they're going to have to set a lower price. We're going to have both the price and output effect. Whichever of those is larger, that's going to be what, dictates what the total effect is on total revenue. Okay. So if total revenue is going up, what would the marginal revenue be? Well, if marginal revenue is the change in revenue, when total revenue goes up, marginal revenues are positive. When total revenue is going down from selling more units, there my marginal revenue would be negative. So if we think about kind of our little table example, going from 0 to 4, my marginal revenue was positive, right? So what was happening in total revenues? They were increasing. As soon as my marginal revenue became negative, well, now as I sell more units, what's happening to that total revenue? Now it starts to decrease. Now, we haven't even factored in costs yet, but if I'm a firm and I want to maximize my profits, if costs were 0, maximizing revenues would be maximizing my profits. So even when costs were equal to 0, I know that I want to produce to get to the highest point of total revenue. Marginal revenue will always be positive. Because even if my costs were 0, if I produce at a point where the marginal revenue is negative, well, there I'm just decreasing my revenues. I'm definitely decreasing my profits, right? Costs are 0 in that scenario. Now, it gets more complicated once we add in costs, but at least up to this point, hopefully we can see, yeah, we would never produce if the marginal revenue wasn't positive, or we'll produce up to the point where it's equal to 0. That's where we'd be indifferent. Okay? So another way of thinking about this is something we talked about way back in module 4, which is elasticities. Okay. So I've got this graph, but I think this is a good summary. I'm going to write this out for us and kind of make the connection, I think, a little bit better. So let's say I've got my demand curve. Okay. We know that there is some point where demand is unit elastic. Okay. At any quantity below that, we said the elasticity of demand is the percentage change in my quantity demanded over the percentage change in my price. Okay. So at these quantities here, what's going to be true? Well, if I'm going from like 0 to anything, what's going to be true about the percentage change in quantity demanded? It's going to be relatively large, right? And if I start out here, well, if price is high, changes in price are going to be relatively small percentage changes. So if my numerator is greater than my denominator, my elasticity in this range is going to be greater than 1, or I'm on the elastic portion of my demand curve. Down here, we said, okay, well now price is low, so changes in price will be large percentage changes. Quantity is now high, so change in quantity will be small percentage changes. Here my elasticity would then be less than 1, or I'm on the inelastic portion. Okay. All right. So, excuse me. If here I'm thinking about as I move from left to right, I'm thinking about what's the marginal revenue of selling one more unit. Okay. Well, what is marginal revenue? Marginal revenue is the change in total revenue. So if I think about what total revenue is, when demand is elastic, I'm going to have a very large change in the quantity, percent change, and a really small percentage decrease in the price. So what's going to be happening? Total revenues will be going up, or for every unit in this range, let's see if I can keep this all in here. I'm thinking about at those quantities, what is total revenue, right? Well, there, total revenue, get some different colors here. Every time I lower the price, I should be increasing my total revenue. Or up to that unit elastic point, if total revenues are going up, then what must be true about my marginal revenue? My marginal revenue must be positive, right? Okay. So in this range, marginal revenue is positive. Now, at the unit elastic point, if the percent change in quantity is the same as the percent change in price, what should be true is that they equally offset each other. So my marginal revenues there would actually be what? Equal to 0, or that's where total revenues are maximized. If I want to continue to sell more units past that unit elastic point, I'm on the inelastic portion of my demand curve. Well, there, now I've got total revenue. I've got very small percent changes in quantity, but very large percent changes in price. Now, I know it's decreasing because as I move this way, quantity is going up, price is going down. So what's going to happen there? Total revenues will decrease. So for every quantity here, as I sell more units and lower the price, total revenues will be decreasing, or my marginal revenues are negative. Okay. So I think we touched on this back in module 4, this relationship between elasticity and total revenue. Here we're going to be a little more focused on, okay, if total revenue is going up, we know that's positive marginal revenue. If it's going down, we know it's negative. We said we haven't factored in costs at all yet, but why would I ever go past, even if costs were 0, right? Why would I ever go past this point where total revenues are maximized? I wouldn't. So the monopolist will always choose a quantity somewhere where the marginal revenue is positive. Okay. Or said differently, where demand is elastic. Okay. So that's kind of what, a little bit of summary just of marginal revenue and elasticities. But I wanted to kind of connect it to total revenue, which is why I kind of left this slide open. Did things, I guess, technically a little bit out of order here, but it doesn't matter how I go through the slides a little bit, if I go one to the other. Okay. All right. So now that we have that in mind, we can think about, okay, we know something about total marginal revenues. We know we have some costs though, right? Its costs aren't 0. So the monopolist is going to set the profit maximizing quantity the exact same way as a perfectly competitive firm would, setting marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. It's just now, instead of the price being, where was that? equal to marginal revenue, right? For a competitive firm, we now know price is not only not equal to that, we said price was below marginal revenue for the monopolist. So what is that monopolist going to do? Well, they're going to figure out the quantity where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. They're then going to figure out at that quantity, what is the last, or what is the, at that unit, what is the consumer's willingness to pay at that optimal kind of profit maximizing quantity? And that's where they'll set the price. Okay. So how, what's that going to look like? Well, our willingness to pay is represented by the demand curve. Okay. So I'll kind of draw this out and then I'll kind of make the comparison to the perfectly competitive market in a second. But let's say I started out, I've got some demand curve, I've got some twice as steep marginal revenue curve. And now we're going to factor in, okay, here's the firm's marginal costs. Okay. So if this was a monopolist, they'll set that profit maximizing quantity where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. They'll then go, okay, at that quantity, I know consumers would be willing to pay whatever point I'm at on the demand curve, right? They'll pay up to that amount. So that's where I'm going to set the price. So they first choose output, then based off the output, they determine what is that price I can get away with charging consumers. Oops, excuse me. Okay. So what is this going to look like, right? Well, I'll spoiler alert it for you. It's going to be a lower quantity than the perfectly competitive market chooses and a higher price. So how do we arrive at that conclusion? Okay. If I can get my papers to unstick. Okay. So if I think about, got quantity, price, I've got market demand here, okay, and I've got my firm's marginal costs. Okay. So before I put in the monopolist, let's think about, okay, if this monopolist was they're the only firm in the market, so their marginal cost really is the supply curve. Okay. So if this was a perfectly competitive market, where would the equilibrium be? Well, it's going to be where supply is equal to demand, right? So our perfectly competitive quantity and our perfectly competitive price would be just where supply is equal to demand. Okay. However, we know that for a monopolist, they face a twice as steep marginal revenue curve. So for them, when they're setting the price, right, they're not taking the price as given from the market, they're setting the price in the market. So where is this marginal revenue equal marginal cost? It's always going to be, if this is where supply is equal to demand, if marginal revenue is a little bit lower, I mean, even if it's infinitesimally lower, it's always going to be at a lower quantity. And then you could, like I said, you could draw this curve however you wanted to, whatever quantity you're at. If you then go up to the demand curve, what'll always be true? Oh, yeah, I'm going to be up at a point for all these quantities on the demand curve where that price that the monopolist can set is higher than the perfectly competitive market. And I think that's intuitive. If I'm the only person selling this good, I can get away with charging a higher price than when there was a lot of competition. Now, what might not be quite as intuitive is I'm going to restrict quantity a little bit in order to keep that price high. But that will always be the case for monopolists as well, is their quantity is going to be a little bit below that perfectly competitive market. Okay. Any questions on that idea before we keep moving? Okay. So I think I have another way of just visualizing this here. Oh, no, I already talked about this. I jumped the gun earlier, which is fine. But we already talked about this, right? Why does that, why do we end up at that lower quantity, higher price? Because that marginal revenue curve is twice as steep. And we can see that if we took total revenue, plugged in our demand equation, took the derivative, we'd see marginal revenue will always be twice as steep. Okay. Let me think if there's anything else I want to say here. So before we'll go through these questions and then I want to return to this idea in a second. Okay. So what's going to be true for this profit maximizing monopolist, right? Well, if I'm thinking about my profit maximizing monopolist, What'll be true for both them and a perfectly competitive firm would be, oh yeah, my marginal revenue is equal to my marginal cost at that kind of optimal profit maximizing quantity. However, what will always be true because we're going up to the demand curve, and right, the demand curve will always be above our marginal revenue curve, the price that we set will always be greater than our marginal revenue and our marginal costs. Okay. So there, we would say, yes, our marginal revenue will be equal to the marginal cost. That's that profit maximizing rule. However, the price we set, we go up to the demand curve, so the price will be greater than both those values. Okay. And then what if I had a table like this? How would I find the optimal quantity for this monopolist to produce? Okay. So if I didn't give you marginal revenue here, you could actually calculate it. So let's just assume I didn't. I could go through, if I go from a quantity of 0 to 5, I've got to lower the price from 10 to 9. Total revenue would just be price times quantity. So 10 times 0 is 0, 9 times 5 is 45, etc. What's my change in revenue from this change in quantity? Well, that's just my marginal revenue. So for those first 5 units, revenue goes up by 45. From an additional 5 units, 45 over 5 is 9. Right? And then what about going from 5 to 10 units? Well, there the change in my total revenue is 35, right? Divided by a change in quantity of 5, marginal revenue is 7. So if my marginal cost is 5, and in a lot of examples, I'll keep it constant to make them easier. You'll notice this in the practice problem eventually once you take the quiz. So if I have constant marginal cost, where would my marginal cost of 5 be equal to this marginal revenue? Well, it looks like the marginal revenue was 5 when I went from 10 to 15 units. So that 15th unit would be the one that maximizes my profits. Okay. Now, a follow-up question that's not on this slide, what then would the equilibrium price for the monopolist be? Or what would the price that the monopolist set be? Well, there I would look at that quantity. It wouldn't be I set it at 5. I would go up to the demand curve. So if I don't have a visual of the demand curve, what does that mean? This price quantity combination, that is my demand curve. So at a quantity of 15, what price is the consumer willing to pay? $7. So that would be the price that they set. Notice the price of 7 is above their marginal revenue of 5. Okay. So same kind of thing was here. The price must be above the marginal revenue and the marginal costs. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving? So what if instead we have marginal cost equal to 0? So your initial instinct might be, well, if I don't have any costs, I'm just going to produce. Why would I stop producing? Well, the reason why is because we said even when costs are 0, marginal revenues at a certain point facing a downward sloping demand curve will become negative. So why would I produce when I have negative marginal revenue? That would just decrease my total revenues. Even if my costs were 0, that's a bad thing. So really, I'm going to produce up to the point where marginal revenue is equal to my marginal cost. So the marginal revenue is greater than or equal to 0 for all the units up to that 25th. Now, I wouldn't go to the 30th unit because if I do that, well, now my marginal revenue is negative. Marginal revenue of -1 is not greater than or equal to 0, so I wouldn't produce 30. Sure enough, if I look at the total revenues, where would total revenues be maximized? At that quantity of 25, okay, and corresponding price of 5. And here, if my costs are 0, what are my profits? Total revenue minus total cost. Well, if my costs are 0, revenues would really just represent profits here. So profits would be maximized at that quantity of 25. Okay. Where am I at? Slides here. Let me think if I want to do something. So I want to go through that. Okay. So we'll do this first, and then I want to show you something with equations. So if I had a perfectly competitive market, and we kind of already looked at this, but just to seeing things a slightly different way sometimes will help it sink in. So if I had a perfectly competitive market, that's simply going to be the price and quantity in that market will be where the supply curve is equal to my demand curve. Right? If I have a monopolist, and I try to draw this in perfectly, so I have the same exact demand curve, the marginal revenue curve they face will be twice as steep. their marginal costs, well, if they're the only producer, their marginal cost represents all of supply. Usually the supply curve is like every firm has their own marginal cost curve. We would then add up all those individual supply curves to get market supply. But here, one firm, their supply curve is market supply. So the perfectly competitive point would be where that marginal cost of the monopolist, which would be all of supply, is equal to demand. However, they make the decision of where the profit maximizing quantity is, where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. That's at a lower quantity than the perfectly competitive market. They then go up to the demand curve and they set a higher price. Right? So marginal revenue will be equal to marginal cost for the monopolist, but the price they set, we said, would be higher. Now, we can see this in tables and graphs. We can also use equations. So I think we'll probably have time tomorrow to work through some more examples like this. And I'll kind of use an easy one today to kind of get at it. Excuse me. And I'll just put up a quick visual so that we have something to go along with this. So let's say I've got my demand curve. And let's say I was given the demand equation that price is equal to 100 minus 5Q. Okay. So the intercept here is 5. Slope is -5. Right. I'm then thinking about, and I will do this a lot of the times to give you an easier example. But let's say I have constant marginal costs, right? And let's say my marginal costs here are 10. Right? Well, if this was a perfectly competitive market, that supply curve of the the marginal cost of the monopolist would be my supply curve. So how could I find this quantity? Well, I would actually just set marginal cost equal to my demand equation and solve for what that quantity is. So I could do that here. So where would supply be equal to demand? Well, that would just be what? 100 minus 5Q is equal to, my supply curve was just constant at 10. A little bit of math, I get what? 90 is equal to 5Q, divide both sides by 5. I get that, what? Quantity is equal to 18. I'm doing math. Wait, am I doing math in my head correct here? Yes. Okay. So this would be like the perfectly competitive quantity. However, monopolists are going to make their decision based off of a twice as steep marginal revenue curve. So if you wanted to, you could go through and say, okay, total revenue is price times quantity for the monopolist. Oh yeah, I've got my demand equation, so I'm going to plug that in. I'm then going to define my marginal revenue, take a derivative of total revenue in respect to Q. If I do that, I end up with what? 100 minus, this is squared, so 10Q, right? So it starts at the same point as demand, but it's twice as steep, right? The slope is -10 now. Now, I can go through and do this every single time, or I can just remember, oh yeah, my marginal revenue equation, it's going to have the same intercept as demand, but it's going to be twice as steep. Okay. So if I then want to solve for where that profit maximizing quantity is for the monopolist, all I'm doing there is setting my marginal revenue equal to my marginal cost. Well, my marginal cost was constant at 10, so 100 minus 10Q is equal to 10. Now it's just a little bit of algebra. Subtract 10 from both sides, move 10Q over. I'm running out of room. So I've got what? 90 is equal to 10Q. Divide both sides by 10, and I get that that monopolist quantity would be equal to 9. Okay. Try to keep this over here. So once I find the monopolist quantity, how do I figure out where the monopolist price is? I go up to the demand curve. So what does that look like with equations? Well, once I know that that profit maximizing quantity for the monopolist is 9, right? I'm going to use that demand curve to figure out what the corresponding price would be. So I'm just going to plug in that quantity of 9. Here I would get what? 100 minus 45, so the price should be 55 that the monopolist sets. Okay. So all I'm going to do is once I find that quantity, right, I'm going to go back and plug it into my original demand equation to find what that corresponding price should be. Okay. So if I'm just writing this out in general terms, if you have equations like this, and you could have a non-constant marginal cost where it was like 10 times Q or something like that, you would go about it the exact same way. In most of these equation examples, I'll give you, on the exam and the quiz, I'll give you a constant marginal cost. But the idea is the steps would be that you first determine what your marginal revenue equation for the monopolist is. So that was just twice as steep as your demand curve, same intercept. You then set marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, do a little bit of algebra to solve for that profit maximizing quantity. You then will take that profit maximizing quantity, plug it into your demand equation, and then solve that for what that equilibrium price must be. Or sorry, not, yeah, if you plug in the quantity, you should be able to kind of compute then what that corresponding price is. Okay. So those are kind of the steps when you're dealing with equations, how you would do this. Okay. Where are we at on time? Okay. Any other questions before we keep moving here? All right. So we've now got this thinking about how we would do this with equations. The next thing we're going to talk about is how does calculating profits look different for a perfectly competitive market compared to a monopolist? Okay. So for the monopolist, really our profit equation is still going to be total revenues minus total costs. So in module 10, we rearranged that equation so that we said that's the same thing as saying take the quantity you're selling, multiply that by the difference between your price and average total cost. Okay. So we have the same profit equation for monopolists as we did for these perfectly competitive firms. It's just that now when we look at this, okay, I can identify the profit maximizing quantity for the monopolist. I then can identify their price, that difference between price and average total cost. That's the first part of my equation. The quantity that the monopolist is selling, that's the second part. This rectangle would represent my profits. Okay. Now, what'll end up being true, and I'll kind of draw you a graph of the long run here in a second, but we know that the profits of a monopolist are always going to be, a single price monopolist should be positive. Okay. So the reason why, so I left this slide blank, we think about the long run. In the long run, we're doing a little bit of review here and then adding stuff in, but like if we had a perfectly competitive firm, we've got their increasing marginal costs. That should, in the long run, right, it hits the, actually, sorry, this is true in the short or the long run, but it should hit that average total cost at its minimum point. And in the long run, we have no fixed cost, so our average total would be the same as our average variable. Okay. Now, we said with these perfectly competitive markets, this will end up being our equilibrium price, right? Where profits would be equal to what? So perfectly competitive profits were equal to 0 because this should be where price is equal to my average total cost. So if we were to draw in our demand curve for this market, and we kind of had, it's kind of weird, like we're assuming that if we had a monopolist, what would be true if it was acting like a perfectly competitive market? So the monopolist marginal cost was our supply curve. So the point where supply is equal to demand, and that's, or marginal costs are equal to the marginal revenue of whatever that equilibrium price is, right? This is going to be the point where a perfectly competitive market would get to. The lowest possible point in their long run average total cost curve, price would be equal to marginal revenue, equal to marginal cost, is equal to average total cost, so profits are equal to 0. If we have a monopolist, right, they're going to face a twice as steep marginal revenue curve. So be careful, because initially when I draw this, it might look like, oh, well, these prices are all below the average total cost, so the monopolist is going to have negative profits. Well, no, right? Because this isn't the curve that the monopolist is going to set prices from. They use the marginal revenue curve to identify where does marginal revenue equal marginal cost. That's how they identify their profit maximizing quantity. They then set the price by going up to that demand curve. So notice for the monopolist, what's true about every quantity in this range? Every quantity, the price or the point we're at in the demand curve is above the average total cost. So that monopolist is going to end up with positive profits in the long run. Okay. As long as there's barriers to entry, right? If there's positive profits, if we didn't have barriers to entry, firms would enter, right? That would kind of force competition, drive that price down to this long run equilibrium price. We'd be back at profits equal to zero. But as long as we have barriers to entry, we know the monopolist production decision will always result in a quantity where profits are positive. Okay. Any questions on this before we keep moving here? Okay. So the next thing we'll talk about, and we'll look at it in a couple slightly different ways. Where are we at in time? Oh, 30 minutes. We are perfect. So if I want to look at the perfectly competitive equilibrium, that's going to be where supply, remember, if we have one firm, their marginal cost would just be all of supply. So where does supply equal demand? Looks like it's right here. So this would be the perfectly competitive price and quantity. Okay. If I think about this is going to be the point, a perfectly competitive market, we said, is where total surplus is maximized. Okay. So total surplus is maximized here, right? What happens if instead we allow the monopolist to choose the quantity? They're going to choose a lower quantity. Well, what is total surplus? Total surplus is adding up at every quantity the difference between the supply and demand curve. So if the monopolist chooses a lower quantity, what are we now missing out on? All of this area here is going to be units that are no longer provided to the market. So we no longer see surplus coming from those units. That's going to be our deadweight loss. Okay. Everybody with me on that? Okay. Now, let's first identify what producer and consumer surplus will look like with a monopolist, and then I'm going to try to draw something out for us to compare that to a perfectly competitive market. So what is producer surplus? Well, if I was writing this out, it's the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal costs to producers. What is the marginal benefit to the producer? Well, that's the price. So for the monopolist, it's the price they set. And then the area above their marginal cost curve up to the quantity they produce. So our producer's surplus, it's going to look kind of similar to a price floor. Right? We've got now a higher price. And so producer surplus will be the area below that price, but above that marginal cost, but only up to that quantity that the monopolist chooses to produce. We then have what is consumer surplus. Well, that's going to be the difference between the marginal benefits and marginal cost to consumers. So their marginal benefit is represented by the demand curve. The cost to consumers is this new price the monopolist sets. So our consumer surplus is going to be this little area up here. And then we already said, what are we missing out on? All of these units that the perfectly competitive market would have produced that the monopolist no longer does. And the total surplus loss is the difference between the marginal benefits in the market, which is the demand curve, and the marginal costs in the market, right? Not specific to producers or consumers, but just overall. Okay. So we've got, with a monopolist, we are going to have some deadweight loss. Okay. So how would I compute this deadweight loss? It goes back to just like we were doing way back in whatever the modules are at 5, 6, and 7, where we're kind of computing deadweight loss if we're not at that perfectly competitive point. So I didn't mean to put the answer up here, but we can kind of reason together as to why it is 56.25. But let's say I had a monopolist. What would the deadweight loss be in this market? Well, they're going to choose the output. Where would the perfectly competitive market choose? Where supply, which if we only have one firm, their marginal cost is the market supply. So where would supply be equal to demand? That's out here at a quantity of 22, right? Or actually not 22. These would be jumps of 5, so 22.5. Okay. What quantity would the monopolist choose where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, so a quantity of 15? They would then set the price up here on the demand curve where we're at that quantity on the demand curve, so a price of 35. So for every unit in between 15 and 22.5, we're missing out on all of this surplus. What is that? It's the area of a triangle. So what is the base of that triangle? 22.5 minus 15, so 7.5. What's the height? 35 minus 20. So 15 times 7.5. We have linear supply and demand, or linear marginal cost and demand. So we then have to multiply it by a half, right? Because it's the area of a triangle. Any questions there before I do a couple more things? Okay. Well, let's do the participation quiz first, and then I'll try to give you a little bit more of an insight as to what's going on with a monopolist in terms of welfare, deadweight loss, etc. But if I remember right, the questions are a little bit easier than what we'll dive into. So I want to make sure we kind of go through the easier stuff first, get a pretty good understanding and feeling with it before we complicate things. All right. Excuse me. So let's say I had a graph like this, and I just wanted to identify the profit maximizing quantity and price. Well, this is literally the problem that we just talked through. So if I'm the monopolist, where is the profit maximizing price and quantity? Where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. So that's going to be a quantity of 15. What price do I set? I don't set the price at 20. We said for the monopolist, price will always be above that marginal revenue and marginal cost. So if I had options here, I know it should be something above 20. Okay, well, they're all above 20, so that's a little harder. I go up to not my average total cost, but I go all the way up to the demand curve. At that quantity of 15, I can set a price of 35. So that profit maximizing quantity and price would be 15 and 35. And then what is the profits? Well, once I've identified that profit maximizing quantity, how do I calculate profit? That's just the quantity I'm selling times the difference between price and average total cost. So I've got the quantity I'm selling is 15. The price I'm setting is 35. And the average total cost at that quantity is 25. So the area of that rectangle would be my profits. So what's the height of that rectangle? I'm going from 35 to 25, so 10 times the width, that quantity going from 0 to 15. 15 times 10 should be 150. Okay. So I think once you can identify the price and quantity, like answering these questions about what profits are shouldn't be too bad based off what we talked about last module. Now, what might be a little bit more tricky is thinking about these surplus values. So try to draw this out in a slightly different way. So let's say I've got my demand curve, and here's my marginal cost, which we said, if there's only one firm, their marginal costs are all of supply. Okay. Here would be my perfectly competitive price and quantity, where supply is equal to demand. Okay. So I'm going to try to use vertical and horizontal. This graph is going to there's going to be a lot going on. So if you don't want to copy it down, I understand. But I think following along will kind of help you see where deadweight loss is, what's happening to both producer and consumer surplus. Okay. So what is consumer surplus? It's the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal cost to consumers. Their marginal benefit is represented by the demand curve, and their marginal cost is simply the price. Okay. What is producer surplus? That's the difference between producers' marginal benefits and marginal costs. The marginal benefit to them is the price, and then their marginal benefit, right, is that, their marginal cost is the marginal cost curve of that supply curve. Okay. So where would producer surplus be here? It'd be the area below price, but above marginal costs for every quantity in the market. So here would be my original producer surplus. So if I think about like these vertical red lines, producer surplus for these perfectly competitive markets. What about consumer surplus? It's the area below the demand curve, but above that price. So we said here we've got our vertical blue lines would be consumer surplus for these perfectly competitive markets. Okay. If I instead think about the monopolist, they're going to face a twice as steep marginal revenue curve. The quantity they set will be where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, so the lower quantity. And then they then go up to the demand curve to set that monopoly price. So where is producer and consumer surplus now? Well, consumer surplus, the difference between the new higher price that they're paying and the demand curve only up to this new monopoly quantity is going to be this area here, right? So we can kind of think about these horizontal lines. That's consumer surplus after we have a monopoly in this market. Where is producer surplus going to be? Well, it's the difference between the price that the monopolist is now setting and our marginal cost. So it would be this area, or kind of represented by our horizontal kind of red line. Okay. All right. So we can kind of see, oh, and I missed, hold on, where's my blue marker at? There we are. What did I miss? When we had a perfectly competitive market, I didn't kind of keep going with my consumer surplus. I should have made sure I have my lines out here, okay? So with the monopolist, right, we'll kind of notice all of the surplus here, right? After the monopolist, nothing is sold past this point. So our new producer plus consumer surplus, this would be total surplus. So what was lost from the original perfectly competitive market, our triangle here, which would represent consumer and producer surplus that was just lost. Okay. Now, notice in this region here, we used to have horizontal blue line, so that was consumer surplus. After it's a monopoly market, this is now producer surplus. So this area here in the middle kind of represents a transfer of surplus from consumers to producers. What used to be consumer surplus is now producer surplus after this firm has monopoly power. It kind of makes sense. They're able to get more surplus when they're the only seller of a good, but it's created some deadweight loss in our market. Okay. And in fact, that deadweight loss, when we were calculating it in that earlier example, to kind of give you a little bit of insight into that, I'm just going to draw that again, just without everything on there, just to make it a little bit easier to visualize. So I've got my demand curve, marginal revenue curve, twice as steep, supply or marginal costs. Here was the quantity the monopolist chose. They go up to the demand curve to set the price. Perfectly competitive market was kind of out here. Okay. So we said the surplus that was lost was the difference between the supply and demand curve for all those units the monopolist no longer produces and puts out on the market. So our deadweight loss will always be the area of this triangle, which what will the base of this triangle always be? It's always going to be the difference between the perfectly competitive and the monopoly quantity. Right? So whatever that reduction in the number of units are, that's going to be the base of our triangle. Now, what is the height of this triangle always going to be? Well, it's always going to start out here at this monopoly price because they go up to the demand curve to set that price. And at that quantity, the bottom part will always be whatever that marginal revenue is for the monopolist at that quantity. So that difference between price and marginal revenue times the difference between the quantities of the two different types of markets. And then because it's a linear supply and demand curve, the area of this triangle, we always have to multiply it by 1/2. Okay. Now, if you're given like grid lines, you can always just grab these numbers, but behind these numbers, this is what they're representing. Right? It's kind of representing this fact that, look, we know that because of this higher price, right, there's going to be a bunch of surplus that's lost out from all of these units that are no longer supplied to the market. Okay, just making sure it wasn't mine. All right, or anyone important. So, one emergency that I'm ignoring. All right, so that should do it for that. Let me think if there's anything else I want to say. I do want to try to start this next topic that will kind of carry us over into tomorrow's class, just so it gives us even more time, saves us more time to be able to have to kind of go through some actual problems tomorrow, kind of similar I did, like hopefully even more than I did for module 10. I also have this like Excel example that I'll probably try to show you tomorrow as well that might help solidify some of these things that we've talked about. So the topic, though, that we'll introduce in the last 15 minutes here today will be the idea of price discrimination. Okay? So price discrimination basically just means that it's not like we're discriminating against specific groups. It's just that we're charging different prices to either different buyers or could even be to the same buyer, but for a different number of units. So we see this all the time with like quantity discounts. Quantity discounts are essentially price discrimination. You're paying a different price for the 5th unit you buy as opposed to the 1st. That is price discrimination, right? Maybe price discrimination, we see like there's early bird special, like if you go a happy hour, well, no, you guys aren't, most of you aren't 21, but if you were, there's happy hour at bars where like prices are cheaper. What are they doing? They're identifying different consumers have different willingnesses to pay at different times during the day. It's the same product, but they're charging a different price because of that difference in willingness to pay. So we think about price discrimination, just charging a different price to different consumers or charging a consumer different prices for the different number or a different quantity they buy of a certain good. Okay. So this willingness and ability to pay, remember, this is simply going to be represented by our demand curve. So what we want to try to do is identify who's high up on that demand curve. They're willing to pay more. I want to charge them a higher price. Whoever is lower on my demand curve, their ability or willingness to pay is lower. I want to charge them a lower price. So I've got an example kind of here. And we'll walk through it, but here was our single price monopolist. And I just kept marginal cost constant to maybe make this a little bit easier. I'll show you what happens if it's not in just a second. But basically, if I'm charging the same price to every single consumer here, consumer surplus will be the area in between demand and the price that they're paying, right? We then said monopoly profits or producer surplus, the area below price, but above our marginal costs. And then all of this would have been deadweight loss because the perfectly competitive market gets out to that point where marginal cost or supply is equal to demand. So we're missing out on all this surplus. If I can perfectly price discriminate, what's going to happen here? So I'm going to draw it out. I think it'll kind of help solidify this idea. So let's say I have constant marginal cost like I did in that example. I've got my demand curve. Single price monopolist faces this twice as steep marginal revenue curve. For a price discriminating monopolist, well, I'm not setting a single price. When we were finding this marginal revenue, it was based off of only setting a single price. If I can charge different consumers different values, if I can identify the person who is willing to pay the highest price, the first person that would buy this good, I can charge them a price up here. I then identify who's willing to pay the second highest. Well, then I can charge them a slightly lower price. Who would be willing to pay the third highest? I can charge them a slightly lower price. Well, then notice, what is producer surplus? It's the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal costs, right? Well, I'm not setting one price now. So the price that I'm setting, it's all the different points on the demand curve. So the demand curve essentially becomes our price. So the difference between the demand curve and the marginal costs, that would represent producer surplus. But notice now, our marginal revenue is changing. It's not one value because every different quantity I can charge a different price, which as a result that's going to be the marginal revenue, right? How much I'm selling the good for. So now where does marginal revenue equal marginal cost? Way out here. So the difference between the price, right, that I'm charging and my marginal cost all the way out to this quantity that the price discriminating monopolist would choose, all of this is going to represent producer surplus. So when I can price discriminate, producer surplus goes up a lot, right? Why? Well, because if I think about here, if this was a single price monopolist, now for all of the consumers in this range, before they would have been willing to pay more, but I was charging this lower price. So if I can charge them higher prices, I can essentially increase this price, the difference between that and my marginal cost. I can take all of that consumer surplus, transfer it to producer surplus. And then for every consumer here that wasn't buying it before, well, I can charge them a slightly lower price and I can earn some additional surplus from them as well. Okay. So I'm able to get the deadweight loss, turn that into producer surplus. I'm also able to convert what used to be consumer surplus if I was charging a single price to producer surplus if I can perfectly price discriminate. Okay. So I now have all of this triangle is going to be producer surplus. Where would the perfectly competitive market get to? Well, that would actually be where supply is equal to demand. So notice the price discriminating monopolists, they would choose the same quantity as a perfectly competitive market. All of total surplus will now be producer surplus. So we actually have deadweight loss is 0. We've gotten to that perfectly competitive quantity. The only issue is, well, what is consumer surplus? Consumer surplus is the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal cost to consumers. Their marginal benefit is the demand curve. Marginal cost is the price they pay. But I'm charging consumers exactly how much they're willing to pay, or the price that exactly where I'm at in the demand curve. So consumer surplus is actually 0. Right? You know, if I wanted to kind of visually, it would be like this line here, but the difference between the demand curve and these prices is always 0. So is price discrimination a good thing? Well, we've reduced deadweight loss, but we also we increased producer surplus, but we also set consumer surplus to 0. So probably not a good thing for you and me if we're buying goods if companies can price discriminate. Okay. So relative to a single price monopolist, oops, get this out of the way here. The price discriminating monopolist increases the quantity in the market, increases total surplus, but now all of surplus is producer surplus and consumer surplus is 0. Okay. So we'll kind of compare a little bit more of like these single price to price discriminating monopolists kind of starting next class. But I did want to make a point here as well. This may seem kind of silly, like, okay, no one can perfectly price discriminate. How can I really identify who's willing to pay higher price? Well, man, with the internet now and how much data is being collected on individuals, you can guarantee, like, you could run this experiment with your friends. You might see advertisements or you might get like exploding offers. So like I get things sometimes from like Temu's a great one. Like they'll send you exploding offers like, oh, get this good for whatever the price is in the next hour. Well, they might be sending that to you, but not to somebody else. And maybe the discount they send to you, you don't know if you're seeing the same discount as someone else. So price discrimination is becoming easier and easier for firms to do because ultimately the price is like, it's not always going to be just a sticker price in a store, right? It's the price that they're showing to you on the internet or on a screen, and they can kind of identify who is willing to pay a higher price for different goods. Okay. Let me think if there's anything else I want to say here about price discrimination. Yeah, we'll walk through these examples next class. We'll then kind of look at some of this cost change stuff. I probably will work through this monopoly example. So I've got this Excel file under module 11s where module 11 materials where we'll kind of build it out. I think it'll be helpful to kind of review kind of some single price monopoly stuff. And then hopefully we should have some time tomorrow to go through some of those practice problems. Okay. So any questions for me before I end the recording here?